In the book of Revelation, chapter 13, the author describes a monstrous figure rising from the sea, the beast. It speaks blasphemies, wages war on the saints, demands worship, and rules over the nations with terrifying power. It's the ultimate end times villain. Then Revelation hits us with a math problem. Let the one with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. Its number is 666. In both Greek and Hebrew, letters doubled as numbers. So, for example, take the name Nero Caesar, write it the way you would have transliterated it into Hebrew letters, then add up the numerical value of each letter, and you get exactly 666. The Roman Emperor Nero makes perfect sense as a villain in Christian apocalyptic literature. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, he was the first Roman ruler we know of to persecute Christians, blaming them for the Great Fire of Rome and subjecting them to brutal executions. If you were writing an apocalypse in that world, Nero was a natural figure to associate with cosmic evil. But hold on, Revelation was probably written late in the 1st century, maybe around the year 90 or 95. Nero died in 68 CE. So why is this supposed vision of the future focusing so much on a Roman emperor who'd been dead for 20 or 30 years? Unless, what if Nero wasn't really dead? Almost immediately after his death, rumors spread that Nero had escaped, fled east, and was planning a return. Some people even claim to have seen him alive, and over the next few decades, several impostors appeared, real individuals pretending to be Nero. So when Revelation describes the return of an evil ruler, it might not just be a metaphor. Revelation's focus on Nero as an end times villain could be tapping into a real political myth already circulating throughout the Roman world, one that said, Nero never really died, and he'll be back. Nero was the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the same family line that gave Rome Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus, but by the end of his reign in 68 CE, Nero had managed to burn through his support in the Senate, the army, and the Roman elite. So, facing rebellion, Nero fled the city. According to the Roman historian Suetonius, he briefly considered escaping to Parthia, Rome's main rival in the east in modern-day Iran, where he hoped to mount a comeback, but he never made it. In fact, he didn't really make it far at all. He ended up hiding in a suburban villa just outside of Rome, where he eventually killed himself around the age of 30. Reactions were split. Some Romans were thrilled. Suetonius says people ran through the streets celebrating and even wearing liberty caps, symbols of freedom from tyranny and slavery. But not everyone was glad he was gone. Despite his reputation as a pretty evil dude, Nero still had some real fans. Suetonius reports that people left flowers on his grave and set up secret statues of him in the Forum. And it's in this mix of public hatred and private devotion that the rumors started to bubble. Nero is dead, or at least that's what the Senate says, but there's a problem. Hardly anyone actually saw the body. No grand funeral, just a quiet burial outside of Rome. That gap left plenty of room for imagination. Did Nero really die? I mean, that's what those elitist senators say. I'm not saying he faked his death, I'm just asking questions. Doesn't it seem convenient? So the rumors start circulating. The historian Tacitus writes that the accounts of his death being many and various, people were all the more inclined to allege and to believe that he was still alive. Suetonius writes that people even started circulating fake imperial decrees, claiming Nero was still alive and would return soon. The Roman historian Dio Chrysostom, writing decades later, said that even now everybody wishes he were still alive, and the great majority do believe that he is. So while the Senate had declared him a dead and disgraced public enemy, others were keeping his memory very much alive. In other words, the perfect setup for a comeback myth. A comeback myth that people tried to exploit. Imposter Neros started popping up. Real people who claimed to be Nero in order to rally political support and retake the Roman throne. The Roman writer Lucian calls one such individual a pseudo-Nero, a fake Nero claiming that he had somehow survived 68 CE. Our sources mention 3 pseudo-Neros, but there were probably more. The earliest pretender appeared right around 69 CE, just 1 year after Nero's death. Tacitus gives us the fullest account, saying that the regions of Greece and Asia Minor were thrown into a groundless panic by a rumor that Nero was at hand. Tacitus doesn't know this guy's name, but he reports the impostor looked a lot like Nero. His skill as a singer and harpist, combined with his facial resemblance to Nero, gave him some credentials for imposture. So whoever this guy was, he looked a lot like Nero and could sing and play the lyre like Nero. That seems like a random detail, but Nero was famous for performing on stage with a lyre, so the association probably helped with the con. And he must have been a real charismatic con artist. Tacitus says he gathered a sizable following of deserters from the Roman army in the Eastern Mediterranean and sailed around arming slaves, looting merchants, and even trying to win over a Roman centurion to his cause. His rebellion came to an end when a Roman governor stopped at his island headquarters with a couple of warships. The fake Nero tried to win over the ship captains, asking them to help him to get to Syria or Egypt. The captains pretended to play along, but came back later and killed him. Tacitus says the guy's body, his eyes, his hair, his whole look was so convincing that they shipped his corpse back to Rome just to be sure he wasn't Nero. The key thing here isn't what this pseudo-Nero actually accomplished, which was basically nothing as a failed rebel, but it's interesting how quickly people in the eastern provinces rallied to his cause. Tacitus puts it bluntly. The great name of Nero attracted many who pined for revolution and hated the existing state of things. And that popularity wasn't random. Nero had spent years cultivating a reputation as a champion of Greek culture. He toured Greece shortly before his death, competed in their festivals, and even launched a canal project at Corinth. A lot of people in the Greek-speaking Eastern Mediterranean loved it. One priest of the imperial cult even hailed him as Nero Zeus, god of freedom. And even the Parthians held him in high esteem. A Parthian prince once saluted Nero as the god Mithras. So while the return of Nero later shows up as something terrifying and evil in the book of Revelation, it apparently began as something far more ordinary and political. There were regular people, especially in the Greek-speaking Eastern Mediterranean, who genuinely missed him, admired him, and were ready to join any cause claiming that he had come back. About 10 years after Nero's death, another pseudo-Nero popped up, this time during the reign of Emperor Titus around 79 CE. The Roman historian Dio Cassius reports that his real name was Terentius Maximus, and just like the first impostor, he supposedly looked and sang like Nero. Terentius Maximus picked up some followers and made his way east toward Parthia, which, as I mentioned, was basically Rome's main rival. At the time, Parthia was dealing with its own messy internal power struggle. The Parthian king couldn't get support from Rome, so he backed the fake Nero, not because he believed him, but because Nero still had recognition and a surprising amount of popularity in the region. Supporting the fake Nero was a cheap, politically useful way to boost his own legitimacy at home, but once the Parthian king got the upper hand politically, he dropped the impostor right away and apparently disposed of him. And there was even a third fake Nero sometime during the reign of Emperor Domitian, probably in the late 80s. We don't know much about this guy. Suetonius mentions him briefly, and that's about it. But like the others, he seems to have shown up in the eastern provinces claiming to be Nero returned. And once again, he managed to attract a following before being shut down by the Roman authorities before it could turn into anything too serious. There were apparently a lot more pseudo-Neros too. Tacitus says that he will cover the adventures and enterprises of the other pretenders. But those later sections of his work have since been lost. But the fact that this kept happening more than a decade after Nero's death shows how sticky the legend had become. Even without social media or mass literacy, word of mouth and regional nostalgia for Nero's reign were enough to keep the story alive that Nero was still out there, waiting to come back. And as an aside, this is not just ancient people being weird. We still see this pattern today. Modern conspiracy movements like certain branches of the QAnon movement have claimed that political figures such as JFK Jr. never died and will someday return to restore order. The details differ, but the psychological mechanism is the same. When a figure becomes symbolic, their death doesn't end their story. It opens the door for rumors and he'll be back legends. So this brings us back to the book of Revelation. The belief that Nero still lives and will return is not stated outright, but many scholars believe that the legend is bubbling in the background. Scholars even have a name for this idea: the Nero Redivivus or Nero Redux myth, literally Nero revived or Nero returned. Though these are modern terms. Regardless, by the time Revelation was written sometime in the late 1st century, rumors of Nero's survival and comeback had been circulating for decades. And as we've seen, several pseudo-Neros had already popped up, and at least 2 of them appeared within recent living memory of Revelation's audience. If you date Revelation to sometime around 90 CE, you're only talking about a gap of 10 years or so from the second pseudo-Nero, Terentius Maximus. And literally only a few years after the third pseudo-Nero, who apparently popped up during the reign of Emperor Domitian. In other words, when Christians read the book of Revelation, talking about a beast who seemed to have a mortal wound but then came back to life and whose number is a cipher for the name Nero, they didn't need to dig deep into ancient history. They could remember actual rumors, actual impostors, and maybe even eyewitness stories of men who had tried to pass themselves off as Nero. And the notion that Nero could still be out there somewhere isn't that outlandish. Had he still been alive, he would have only been in his 50s. To see how Revelation might be picking up on these legends and reworking them, we need to look at two key passages, chapter 13 and chapter 17, which both seem to credibly allude to Nero and legends circulating after his death. Chapter 13 is the most obvious engagement with the Nero legend, which we saw at the start of this video. Here the author John sees a beast rising out of the sea, and one of its heads seemed to have a fatal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole world marveled and followed the beast. Later, another beast comes from the land and causes everyone to worship the first beast from the sea, whose deadly wound was healed, and tells them to make an image of the beast that had been wounded by the sword and yet lived. A lot of scholars see the beast from the sea as a symbol for the Roman Empire, and the heads as different emperors. According to most readings, the head with the fatal wound is Nero, which Revelation says had been wounded by the sword and yet lived, a reference to Nero killing himself with a dagger. The chapter ends, as we saw, with an invitation to calculate the number of the beast. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number for a person. Its number is 666. Now, as I say in other videos, this is called gematria, a practice when you assign a numerical value to a word, phrase, or name. As I mentioned, in both Hebrew and Greek, every letter has a numerical value, and you could write numbers using letters. Ancient writers sometimes played with this, turning names or phrases into numbers that carried symbolic meaning. So for example, my name Andrew in Greek is Andreas, and the gematria for my name would be 1 plus 50 plus 4 plus 100 plus 5 plus 1 plus 200, equaling 361. So I'm not the beast, stop worrying. And when you write Nero Caesar in Hebrew letters and then add the numerical value of those letters, you get 666. Some manuscripts of Revelation say the number is 616 instead of 666, which is what you get when you drop the final N from the name, which is a more Latinized form. This suggests early copyists knew the name Nero was behind this number, and some scribes likely adjusted the number to match the spelling they were familiar with. Scholars see Nero showing up again in chapter 17, though this time in an even more veiled and symbolic way. Revelation 17 reintroduces the beast from the sea from chapter 13. The beast that you saw was, and is not, and is about to ascend from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will be amazed when they see the beast, because it was, and is not, and is to come. Some scholars argue that this three-part formula, was, is not, is to come, echoes Nero's rumored return. He was emperor and he will return. It also seems to be a parody of the three-part formula applied to God, the one who was, who is, and is to come, though I'll unpack this more in a bit. Revelation 17 then adds another layer to the beast imagery. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. To any first century audience, this didn't need explanation, the city of Rome being a city famously situated on 7 hills. But then John immediately gives a second interpretation, that the 7 heads also represent 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is living, and the other has not yet come. As for the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction. Interpreters have wrestled with this passage for centuries. Some scholars argue that the number 7 here is purely symbolic, as the totality of Roman imperial power. Others have tried to identify these 7 kings with specific Roman rulers, but this has been very difficult to do. Even the Romans themselves disagreed about how to count their emperors. Some lists begin with Julius Caesar, others begin with Caesar Augustus, and then you have the chaotic years after Nero's death with a series of extremely short-lived emperors, who all just ruled for a few months each. Do you count those too? Scholars have offered a few possible schemes, but no single lineup works clearly. If you start with Julius Caesar and exclude the 3 rapid-fire emperors, Nero would be the 6th emperor in this lineup. Other interpretations put him as the 5th of the fallen emperors. But however you count these kings, a lot of scholars think the 8th king is a nod to Nero, the beast who was and is not. And the following verses seem to tap into widespread expectations that Nero would return at the head of a massive army from the east. Verse 12 introduces 10 kings represented by the beast's 10 horns. The 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but they receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. Scholars have argued that the idea of 10 kings would have naturally evoked for the audience the network of client kingdoms operating around Rome and especially in the eastern territories. See, the Roman Empire wasn't only made up of provinces directly ruled by Roman governors, it also included a patchwork of small semi-independent dynastic kingdoms, like Judea, Nabatea, and Commagene. These regions were ruled by local kings who owed their position to Rome, and the most famous example is Judea under the dynasty of Herod the Great. Herod was not an independent monarch. He was appointed king of Judea by the Roman Senate and served at Rome's pleasure. After his death, his sons and relatives continued to rule, rising or falling depending on Rome's approval. Scholars argue that Revelation chapter 17 is recasting these client kings as future allies of the returning Nero, who will receive authority only in the moment when they join forces with him. This is a little more clear when we compare Revelation to other texts adapting the Nero returns legend. See, around the same period, Jewish writers were doing something very similar in a collection of texts known as the Sibylline Oracles. These were Jewish prophecies written in the voice of a pagan Greek oracle aimed at a Hellenized audience. One of the clearest examples is the 5th Sibylline Oracle, probably edited in its final form in the early 2nd century CE, sometime around the reign of Hadrian. The text never comes out and says Nero, but it might as well. It talks about the one whose name begins with the number 50, that is, the letter N. He will be commander, a terrible snake, breathing out grievous war, who one day will lay hands on his own family and slay them. That final detail is an unmistakable jab at Nero, who was infamous for murdering his mother. The oracle goes on to say that the ruler flees east to the Medes and the Persians, a clear reference to the Parthian Empire, and eventually returns to wage war. We see the same pattern in Sibylline Oracle Book 4. A great king will flee from Italy like a runaway slave, unseen and unheard over the channel of the Euphrates River, when he runs away beyond the Parthian land. A few lines later, the oracle announces his return. And the fugitive of Rome will also come, brandishing a great spear, having marched across the Euphrates with his many myriads. Taken together, these oracles reflect a broader myth that Revelation chapters 13 and 17 seem to be drawing on. Nero flees east, gains support among Eastern rulers, and returns as a hostile force. And remember, this was not a purely symbolic idea. Nero really was rumored to have fled east, and the most famous pseudo-Nero, Terentius Maximus, actually did ally himself with the Parthians. So it seems that the Sibylline oracles in Revelation are both drawing on a larger political myth about Nero's possible return. Though as we saw with those fake Neros in the Greek-speaking East, Nero's rumored return often had a positive vibe. They liked Nero. A lot of people saw it as a good thing, a triumphant comeback of a popular ruler. The folks who rallied behind the fake Neros probably imagined a restored emperor coming back to reclaim what was rightfully his. But try to imagine that same narrative from a Jewish or Christian point of view. A powerful figure returning at the end of history, not as a savior, but as a destroyer and persecutor. From that perspective, the Nero legend sounds a lot like an inversion of the Messiah, a kind of anti-Christ before that concept fully formed in Christian theology. So scholars argue that Revelation 13 and 17 are drawing on versions of the Nero legend that imagine him returning not only as a reconquering king from Parthia, but also as a kind of satanic end times ruler, a fake messiah who imitates Christ, performs miracles, demands worship, and leads a global deception. Consider a passage from Sibylline Oracle 3, which refers to a coming figure named Belial, a satanic figure or an alias of Satan. He will raise up the dead and perform many signs. He will indeed lead men astray, and he will lead astray many faithful chosen Hebrews. This text doesn't name Nero directly, but says Belial will come from the line of Augustus, which might be a clue that this oracle is referring to Nero. We get a much more explicit reference in the text called the Ascension of Isaiah, a Jewish and Christian apocalypse which depicts Nero as a literal incarnation of Belial. And after the world has come to its consummation, Belial, the great prince, the king of this world who has ruled it since it came into being, shall descend. He will come down from his firmament in the form of a man, a lawless king, a slayer of his mother. This king will persecute the plant which the 12 apostles of the beloved have planted, and one of the 12 will be delivered into his hand. It's not subtle. A lawless king who slays his mother and persecutes the early Christian community, with one of the 12 apostles being delivered into his hand. All of that is Nero, the guy who infamously persecuted Christians and, according to tradition, executed the Apostle Peter. So here, and possibly also in Sibylline Oracle 3, Nero becomes a demonic king at the end of time, and scholars think this is what we see in the Book of Revelation. Richard Bauckham calls this a Christological parody. Basically, Revelation draws on a whole bundle of existing legends about Nero and turns them into a deliberate Christ parody. So compare Revelation 13 with that passage from the Ascension of Isaiah. In the latter, Belial, identified with Nero, comes in the form of a man, performs signs and wonders, deceives the world, and gets people to worship him. Revelation 13 does the same with the beast, also identified with Nero with the cipher 666. The whole world marvels and follows him, he works miracles, and people bow down to his image. Also in Revelation 5, the risen Christ appears as a lamb standing as if slain, while Revelation 13 describes one of the beast's heads as if slain, but its mortal wound was healed. Later the text says he was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The author seems to be deliberately recycling the same phrasing from chapter 5. The beast is killed and then somehow lives again. Chapter 17 adds another layer to this parody of Christ. The beast is described as the one who was, and is not, and is to come. This is almost a copy-paste of one of Revelation's holiest titles for God, the one who was, and who is to come. Scholars argue that this is setting up Nero's return as a pathetic parody of Christ's own return. So Revelation is using the Nero returns legend in a very sophisticated way. It knows the legends, it knows the Jewish apocalyptic material, and it stitches them together so that Nero becomes a Christ parody figure. A satanic knockoff of Jesus, whose death and return counterfeit Christ's own death and return. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. So last May, I led the very first Religion for Breakfast tour. I traveled around Ephesus and the surrounding region in Western Turkey with a group of 24 incredible people. It honestly felt like a university study abroad trip. Everyone was curious, engaged, they were asking great questions. We spent our days exploring ancient temples, theaters, and basilicas, talking through how ancient religion worked on the ground. It was honestly one of the highlights of my year. So I'm thrilled to say we're doing it again. The next tour runs from May 24th to the 30th, 2026, and if you're interested, now is the time to jump in. Registration is moving fast, and I'm planning to close the signups in just a few weeks. There are only a handful of spots still open, so if you've been thinking about it, head on over to religionforbreakfast.com to see the full itinerary. This tour starts from a simple premise, that Western Asia Minor is best understood as a religious landscape. It's a region where multiple systems of practice and belief overlapped. Greco-Roman polytheism, vibrant Jewish communities, and some of the earliest Christian churches, all living in the same dense urban environments shaped by civic religion, local identity, imperial power, and everyday ritual life. Over the course of a week, we'll trace that landscape across some of the most remarkable archaeological sites in the Mediterranean. We'll visit the Temple of Apollo at Didyma, one of the great oracular sanctuaries of the ancient world, where people and entire cities once traveled to consult with Apollo. We'll go up to the Temple of Trajan on the Acropolis of Pergamon, and talk through what the imperial cult actually meant for local communities, and why the Book of Revelation seems so focused on Roman imperial power. And of course, we'll explore early Christian spaces like the Basilica of St. John in Ephesus. My hope is that you'll walk away from this tour really understanding why this region mattered so much for the development of Christianity, and why the author of Revelation was so preoccupied with what was happening in these cities. Remember that the Book of Revelation is addressed to 7 churches in Western Asia Minor, and we'll be visiting 5 of them. So if exploring that world with me sounds exciting, or if you just want a deeper immersion into the archaeology and history behind ancient Mediterranean religion, you can register at religionforbreakfast.com. Again, only a few spots are left, and registration will close soon. I hope you'll consider joining us, and maybe I'll see you in Turkey.